They passed events for my main class to defer the crowd in on time.
Yes, and I think as a moderator, that's one of my responsibilities as well. So let's you and I get on task.
Okay.
She was like, it's gonna start. Are you at the office across the street? Yes. Yeah, that's cool there. You can just walk right in. Yes, you may. And I'm realizing I'm more forcing effort to do that, so. Okay. Yeah, so you're I need a mic.
Okay. Okay.
Three mic. All right. If everyone could take their seats. Is everybody mic'd up now? All right. Thank you all. I'm not going to say too much. You have the program in front of you. We're starting the panel on utility resource planning. Our moderator is Vicki Mandel. On the panel, we have Julie Blunden, Virginia Lacey, Erin Overturf, and Caitlin Shields. So please welcome them, and we look forward to it. Good morning.
Where's V? I think they're working on that.
Oh, there it goes.
Goes great. Thank you. I can tell it's on now. Thank you. So good morning and welcome. And I want to thank Sharon Jacobs and Alice Madden for inviting me. It's an honor to be selected to be. Is it on?
Turn it up.
Still need to speak up. Oh, okay, here we go. I can tell it's on now. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate and to be a moderator, especially to Alice Madden and Sharon Jacobs. We have quite a group here of remarkable professionals in the energy law and energy regulation area, and I'm very honored to be associated with this panel. So I personally have been practicing in the energy law and regulation area for over 20 years. I've represented a variety of clients, corporate, nonprofit, government, and I've also done some work in telecommunications regulation. I've practiced before approximately 20 public utility commissions and both FERC and the FCC. And the topic today, electric resource planning or utility resource planning, is something that, first of all, is extremely active before the Colorado Commission right now. We have a pending case that we're going to be talking about quite a bit on this panel, and it brings forth a lot of the themes that were talked about earlier in the conference and by former FERC Commissioner Honorable last night. So generally, utility resource planning is a planning process whereby it's usually regulated by a commission, and different stakeholders come into the process to look at forecasted demand and what the best generation and demand response mix is for meeting future need over a specific period of time. And the stakeholder process is definitely the interesting part of it. And we'll be talking a little bit about the history and how it has changed dramatically over time, this process, how it's become more inclusive and looked at broader public policy factors, and particularly the themes from the earlier panel will also be reflected in what we're going to be talking about today. So the panelists that we have today are some of the people that I respect the most in the utility practice here in Colorado. And in order of presentation, we have Erin Overturf, who's the Chief Energy Counsel for Western Resource Advocates, which is a regional conservation organization, NGO, very influential in policymaking in the state of Colorado and elsewhere in the West. And Erin, I've seen her in practice in court and in negotiations, and she is I personally believe, one of the most brilliant oral advocates that you will ever see. Standing and going, she is just brilliant and incredibly persuasive. Secondly, we have Caitlin Shields, who is an energy attorney with a specialty in environmental regulation. She practices at the state and federal level, has broad experience, and seems to just know everybody in the room. Commissioner Honorable was delighted to see you last night. Next, we have Julie Blunden, who is the founder of Julie Blunden Consultants. She is the board chair of CalCEF Catalyst and a board member of CalCEF Ventures, and she's served in executive roles in a variety of companies, including Sun Power, Sun Edison, Green Mountain Energy, Kima X Energy, and she's currently president and director of ClimateWorks Foundation. And then our fourth panelist is Virginia Lacey. She is a principal with Rocky Mountain Institute. Rocky Mountain Institute, she's within the electricity practice, and they work to accelerate the clean energy transformation. She has quite a bit of quantitative data information in her presentation, which will be very nice, and she focuses on distributed resources. So I will also follow the law school tradition, and at the end of the panelists' presentations, I will ask for at least one law student question before we go into my own questions and questions from the audience. So without further ado, Erin, could you please begin? Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Erin Overturf, and as Vicki said, I work with Western Resource Advocates. We're a regional conservation organization. And so while I spend most of my professional life at the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, I'm also familiar with the way that commissions work throughout the West. And so my role here today, I think, is to give you all a little preview about what electric resource planning or integrated resource planning is, and kind of what are some of the things that states in the West are doing and doing particularly well that we could all be, there's room for improvement in every state, and I think we can look at the variety of approaches that different states have taken in order to craft the Frankenstein perfect resource planning process that is what we're all really dreaming of. So I want to start off by talking about what resource planning is at a very high level. What are we trying to accomplish when we go through this months-long and sometimes years-long process? And then again, what are some of the best practices that we see from around the West? And when I explain what resource planning is to random people at children's birthday parties, which happens more often than you would expect, I sum it up like this. First, we're trying to predict the future. And second, we're trying to avoid regrets. And it's kind of like all things in life. So when we engage in resource planning, we're looking out into the future and we're deciding if the current energy system that we have is sufficient, if it's going to meet our needs, or if we're going to need to acquire additional generating resources to meet the demands that the people in our community are going to have. So that means we've got to look out into the future and predict how many people are going to be moving to our community. How much energy are they going to use? Are they getting more efficient or less efficient? Are they going to want to buy all their power from the grid, or are most of them going to want to have distributed energy resources where they're producing their own energy on their home? Is everybody going to get an electric vehicle? If so, how are they going to want to charge it? Slow over the course of an entire evening, or really quickly, all at once? We have to make informed assumptions about all of these things and a whole lot more when we're doing resource planning. And then, if we make all those assumptions and we look out and we decide, yeah, we're going to need some new stuff to meet all this load, then we've got to decide what we should get, what we should acquire, right? And we've got to decide what that generation should be. And this, in turn, means that we're making decisions about hugely expensive, long-lived capital assets. So this requires us to think about the characteristics that are most important to us as a community. Is it above all else keeping electricity prices low? Is it reducing pollution and slowing the effects of climate change? Is it diversifying our electricity system to manage risk that we can all expect? Is it spurring technological innovation? These all can be different priorities that a community might have that are going to impact the resources that we select as part of a resource planning process. So there's lots of acronyms and models and technical details that go along with resource planning, but ultimately, we want to make sure that 10 or 20 years from now, we're not regretting the decisions that we're making today. And notably, this is pretty similar to the advice that I expect to give my son when he's old enough to start dating. So now let's get to the good stuff. One of the things that I like about this group of people and the people that are collected in this room is that there are a lot of people who do spend a lot of time talking about utility regulation, and so know what we're kind of talking about here. So I'd like to get into some of the nitty-gritty details. And there's 4 characteristics I'd like to highlight about what I think are most important about resource planning. What are the characteristics of really great resource planning processes? And from my perspective, this is just me, Erin Overturf talking, I think they're timeliness, collaboration, responsiveness, and finality. And I'd like to talk about each of those kind of in turn. So first, timeliness. Those of us who spend our days in the energy policy world know that things are changing, and they're changing incredibly quickly. What was true 4 months ago is not necessarily true today, let alone 4 years ago. And that's the time frame that we do a lot of resource planning. That's the time frame we use here in Colorado. So federal policy, resource economics, technological innovation, they're all changing at an unprecedented rate. And in this environment, it's really important for resource planning to be timely and frequent enough that it can be responsive to those changes. So in this sense, I would look to the Pacificorp model that our staff members in Utah deal with, where they engage in an IRP every 2 years, and they do an update on the off years. So this allows planning to be an iterative, continuous process that it's not kind of a stop and start. They're close enough together that you're constantly refining what you think those assumptions are and updating your plans. In contrast, in states like Colorado, where resource planning happens every 4 years, or even Nebraska, where it happens every 5 years, resource plans tend to be kind of a snapshot in time, and they can already be kind of outdated by the time they're finalized. So if it takes 18 months to finalize a resource plan or 2 years to finalize a resource plan, the result you're getting at the end, if you had known the things you knew now back 2 years ago when you had filed the application, it might look a lot different. So the second component I'd like to talk about in terms of qualities of good resource planning is collaboration. And you heard a lot about collaboration this morning, and I think in terms of thinking about collaboration in the context of resource planning, it's interesting to contrast Arizona and Utah with Colorado. So in Arizona, there's a requirement that commission staff hold a series of workshops prior to the filing of resource plans. And that's where stakeholders can sit around in a room together and engage in verbal, face-to-face conversations about assumptions and inputs. They answer questions like, how much efficiency should we assume there's going to be? Is it better to acquire distributed resources or big utility scale resources? What's gas going to cost in the future? Will there be carbon regulation? What will that look like? Should we incorporate externalities in our assumption and the decisions that we're making? Every single person in this room, I'm sure, has feelings about the right answer to each of those questions. I think what you think are appropriate input assumptions for resource planning shows a lot about kind of who you are as a person and what your values are. And there's a lot of value in having stakeholders together, face-to-face, having an opportunity to talk through why they're making the assumptions they are, so that they can try to find common ground in advance of filing that kind of an application. And you can contrast this with Colorado, where there's no requirement to have any kind of a stakeholder meeting in advance of filing a resource plan. So that means that the primary way for stakeholders to unpack what a utility's rationale is for its assumptions is through the highly formal and conflict-driven process of discovery and pre-filed written testimony. So there's not really a formal opportunity to sit down and look somebody in the face and ask them, why did you do this? Help me understand what your thinking is here, because it doesn't make sense to me and I really need to figure out where you're coming from. And if you ask a discovery question that says, tell me what you're thinking, you're not going to get an answer. So, so that process of having to go through discovery rather than engaging in more personal stakeholder processes, I think can really limit what's possible in a resource plan. And going through that litigated process, and essentially, as an intervener, when a resource plan is filed, it's basically like 1,000 pages of testimony that's arrived on my desk, and now it's my job to figure out what the heck is going on in that resource plan. That's really, that can be really daunting, and it would save a lot of time and heartache, I think, if we could have some of those productive conversations in advance. So the third component of really A+ resource planning, I think, is responsiveness to the needs and incorporation of the needs of the community. And this is something that all states in the West are doing to some degree or another, but I think it's really worth highlighting because it is so critical. So sometimes this can be really clear and concrete. So if a state legislature has a renewable portfolio standard, renewable energy standard, that's a really clear expression of a community's goals that you can just kind of put right into a resource planning process. There might be other goals that a legislature or people through a ballot initiative process have identified, like encouraging distributed energy resources or expanding energy efficiency, and those need to be taken into account when we're doing resource planning. But there's other broader societal costs and benefits that I would argue should, if possible, be considered as part of this resource planning. If you're building a power plant, a coal-fired power plant in the arid West, it's really prudent to look at how much water that facility is going to use and take that into account. We do that, for example, here in Colorado. Or if you're evaluating building a coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant, what are the carbon emissions from those plants going to be, and how are those decisions you're making about that plant going to contribute to the wide variety of economic and ecological impacts of climate change. Those are important things to consider. And states like Colorado, Nevada, and Arizona do take those types of inputs into account when they're making resource decisions. In short, resource planning is not just about keeping bills low. I know Caitlin's going to talk about how that historically was the primary purpose of resource planning. But I think it's really about making optimal decisions, weighing a variety of factors and really trying to think about how can we make no regrets decisions today. And then the final element of effective resource planning is, appropriately enough, finality. So what do I mean by finality? This one is kind of a legalistic thing, but I think it's really important. Ideally, at the conclusion of the resource planning process, the utility should receive a decision from a commission that says, all right, we've considered all these variables, we've weighed all the costs and benefits, and we believe it's prudent for you to go out and buy power plant X. This is what's known in lawyer speak as a presumption of prudence, and it gives the utility a certain amount of certainty that it's going to be able to recover the costs that it spends to go out and buy power plant X, unless it really screws something up. So here, I really feel like I need to praise Colorado, because I think we do this really well here in Colorado. Here, when a resource plan is approved, the company, if it does the stuff it said it was going to do in its approved resource plan, it's presumed to have acted prudently. So long as it's acting in accordance with the plan, we assume that the utility is acting prudently. And there's a really high standard for any intervener that wants to come in and argue that the company really messed up and it shouldn't recover its costs, because now with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that wasn't the decision that we should have made. This is really, really critical, because it's the key that makes resource planning meaningful. It gives it real consequences. And because we have that finality element here in Colorado, I think you see that parties, the utility, stakeholders, really engage meaningfully in the resource planning process, because we know that's where you've got to put on your best case, because that's kind of the only chance you've got to make a decision and impact the resource selections that are being made. And you can contrast this with other states, like in New Mexico, for example. At the end of a resource plan, the utility just receives a presumption of prudence for a kind of squishy resource type. So in New Mexico, you go through a resource plan, and at the end of it, it'll say, you've got a presumption of prudence for 400-ish megawatts of wind, as opposed to you have a presumption of prudence for this particular wind plant that's located at this place for this price. And that, combined with some other components of the way stuff works in New Mexico, means that parties are routinely relitigating specific resource decisions, which is it's a really big burden to put on interveners like WRA, who, Rebecca Cantwell was saying, we're also a small organization, and it's hard to ramp up and put on a case when you're going up against a big giant utility that seems to have unlimited resources. So it's really important that those resource planning decisions are meaningful, and that gives a single place where stakeholders can really engage and hopefully come up with really great decisions. So in conclusion, resource planning is super important. Mm-hmm. And ideally, it's going to be timely, collaborative, responsive, and it's going to result in final decisions. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Erin, that was wonderful. Those themes were great. And then the comparison for different states, that was really, really helpful. So thank you. Please, Caitlin.
Yes, Erin did a great job kicking that off with a really nice insight into resource planning and what it is. I'm going to kind of take what Erin said. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to step back and look at resource planning from even a more macro level than Erin just did. And then I'm actually going to dig down and look at it at a more micro level from what Erin did, and talk a little bit more specifically about how it works here in Colorado, and exciting plan that has come before the Colorado Public Utilities Commission that I'll give an overview of. The three things that I'm going to hit on are number one, historical trends in resource planning. Particularly, number two, looking at some of the political and social influences that have pushed resource planning along the years to kind of go from really what wasn't much of an integrated resource planning process to today where we're at, which is across the country some form of integrated resource planning or resource planning that differs very different state to state. And then three, I'll talk about the Colorado resource planning process as well as the Colorado Energy Plan that some in the room might be familiar with. So number one, historical trends and observations. I think that it's important, particularly whether it's resource planning or in any dialogue about electricity, to step back and remember that electricity is something that touches almost everyone in the country every single day, multiple times. It is perhaps only air or even water are kind of the really two things out there that I can think of that we might interact with more than electricity. Aside from air and water, though, electricity is a man-made resource or man-made commodity. And that said, electricity is something that a lot of people probably, or at least in my experience, I would say, take for granted. It's something you can go, you wake up, you turn your light on, you turn your phone on. The refrigerator's there. It's hard for some of us to really appreciate what goes into getting the lights on and what goes into having the lights run in a very reliable way and in a cost-effective way. So that said, reliability, cost-effectiveness are two of the overarching themes and goals that have always, at least in the U.S., and probably will continue forevermore to predominate the resource planning process. That said, because of the unique nature of electricity, most households in the United States pay for it. Virtually every commodity that you buy, some part of that price is going to pay for the electrons that were used to manufacture that Snickers bar or that plastic water bottle that you're drinking out of. Because of the breadth and the size of the industry, it's also certainly subject to political and social whims, for better or worse. And just to provide a little bit of historical context, I think it's interesting before kind of looking at, the in the weeds issues of really where we are today and a presumption of prudence for a wind farm. Well, how did we get here? And a couple of interesting things. In the 1920s and 1930s, United States, we did not have a comprehensive electric grid across the United States. Electricity was provided by private companies for the most part, and because of that you would have some urban areas that had electric systems, and then you would have adjacent rural areas with no electricity whatsoever. Interestingly, it was kind of during that time period that FDR started looking at this, and as part of the New Deal, said, I think we need to electrify the nation, and promoted policies that would not only build electricity throughout the country, but one of the policies was also to encourage hydropower as a domestic resource that the country could use, not only to electrify the nation and promote business, but to promote employment. And so that's a key kind of policy and social consideration that even today you'll see comes up in electric resource planning processes, which is the role of the energy industry or the electric utility industry in employing people and creating jobs and sustaining jobs. And another big era was in the 1970s during the Arab oil embargo. So this was a pretty kind of revolutionary, impactful time in our nation's history, particularly for the energy industry. And so one of the kind of key responses to the oil embargoes was a focus on national energy policy, domestic energy production. And so at that time, we saw a move away from petroleum-fired power plants, as well as incentives and a desire to move to domestic generation, and also another resurgence of hydropower. From the late 70s to the 80s, several other kind of big policy things happened. Chernobyl was a big event that inspired kind of a national security, and not only environmental concerns, but safety and security concerns with the nuclear industry. And so that's been a big kind of event that has shaped how we as a country, how states have come to look at resource planning and what sort of fuels we want to promote, what sort of fuels we might not want to promote. During the same time, the late 70s, an environmental movement began in the country, and so we saw the PURPA, which was really one of the first, I think I think that it may have actually been kind of the first major legislative initiative to begin to open the generation sector to independent generators, not just utility-owned, utility-run generation. And so that was something that would begin to pave the way for other generators to come in, and states began to sort of grapple with, okay, well, how do we allow some of these external generators to come in? What's the process that we want to look at for integrating solar resources and other small-scale renewable resources into the grid? During that time, so particularly the late 70s and 80s, there were a handful of other drivers, predominantly financial drivers, so interest rates, cost overruns at generation facilities, that was really what began the movement toward integrated resource planning, and where states started to decide we need to be looking at resource planning from an integrated perspective, and not just looking exclusively at cost effectiveness and reliability, although those have always been the two paramount concerns, but start coming up with a process to take into account some of these social and political concerns, and being able to deploy and build and use resources in the most efficient way possible so that we can continue to meet cost effectiveness and reliability concerns. So that was really kind of when the birth of resource planning took place. The 1990s were another major shift in electric regulation. Many states went through large restructuring. Power markets emerged. Here in Colorado and much of the West, we still have vertically integrated states. Restructuring was a major way for particularly states with large population centers, predominantly kind of out in the East or some parts of the Midwest, where they could begin to kind of look at resources and dispatch in a more comprehensive model and rely on power markets to more efficiently utilize and move electricity amongst utilities and jurisdictions and states and regions. That said, I am not planning on really getting into some of the market issues, but it is an interesting time for power markets because many of those jurisdictions are currently kind of being haunted by some of the major restructuring efforts that took place, and are now, some states are trying to grapple with nuclear and coal plants that have become uneconomic in markets, and trying to figure out, do we want to prop these up? How do we prop these up? We've been struggling to get much of a federal response to it. That said, as Colette mentioned last night, the Department of Energy has come out requesting that FERC effectively come up with some sort of pricing scheme that would help keep afloat some of the struggling baseload power plants. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into that. And I think that brings us to today, which is that I think particularly from a resource planning perspective, we are on the verge of a new massive paradigm shift. And that is between new technologies and renewable energy and community, civic, social desires to change the way that energy is used and energy is consumed, particularly moving from the large centralized plant model to a more distributed model. And I think that some of our other panelists are going to dive a little bit more into some of those areas. And so while the utility as we know it is adapting, the resource planning process is certainly, I think, in the midst of trying to adapt. And I think we will continue to see the resource planning models across the country adapt. From that, I'm now going to kind of jump a little bit more into the micro level. And that is, what do we do here in Colorado? In Colorado, as Erin mentioned, every 4 years we go through, for investor-owned utilities, so I'm going to say regulated utilities, there's a resource planning process that occurs every 4 years. That process is overseen by the Public Utilities Commission. The Public Utilities Commission is a body in Colorado with 3 commissioners that are appointed by the governor. They are confirmed by the Senate. There's no requirement necessarily that those commissioners have an extensive background in utilities or utility regulation. We've been lucky, particularly with our current set of commissioners, to have very well educated and very committed commissioners who are sitting on the commission and have put a lot of effort into really wanting to understand their cases and work to move Colorado forward. The commission is a creature of statute, and that's very important because the commissioners in and of themselves, in their public capacity, it is not their job to decide policy. It is not their job to say, I have a personal preference for renewable energy, and this is best for the state of Colorado. Their job is to implement state policy that the state legislature has passed. Now, that certainly leaves them with very broad authority, and there is a lot of policy making that ends up going on because frequently they are left with a directive to promote renewable energy, something like that, and then they need to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to do that? And the very important thing that the commission is tasked with is that they are economic regulators, so they carry out those policy objectives and will always be tasked with looking how to meet the state's policy objectives in a cost-effective manner while ensuring reliability. Colorado's ERP rules require, kind of at the highest sense, 2 things. One, that the commission periodically examine a utility's energy sales and demand forecasts as compared to existing resources to ensure sufficient generation will meet the future needs. And then 2, ensure that the investor-owned utility acquires a cost-effective mix of additional resources consistent with the state's policy objectives, such as the state's renewable energy standard. So we do have a commission that has been tasked with pretty clear objectives when it comes to, well, maybe I shouldn't say very clear objective, but there's certainly a level of consideration for environmental, renewable energy, clean energy that the commissioners are to take into account when they're going through the resource planning process. Here in Colorado, there's a 2-phase process. During the first phase, the Public Utility Commission reviews and approves that 1,000-page electric resource plan that the utility files with gobs of testimony to acquire new resources. They issue determination of need, so as part of that process, it's looking to, okay, how much load growth are we going to have over the next amount of however many years the resource acquisition period is. In this case, with our current plan, 8 years. So they're looking ahead to how many megawatts of electricity or of energy are going to be needed to meet whatever the future load growth is going to be. Next, and the acquisition process. And so Colorado has a clear preference for going through a competitively bid RFP. Theoretically, the utility could come in with an alternative process, but there's a clear commission preference for going through a competitively bid process to bring new resources online. And then approving the components of the RFP. So this is contracts, the process, the procedure for actually acquiring how the RFP will be issued and how resources will be acquired. And then a handful of alternate scenarios for assessing the customer benefit of various portfolios that ultimately are brought forth. So that might include, such as the last plan, the commission directing the company to run sensitivities on carbon costs, so the potential cost of carbon regulation or the social cost of carbon. The RFP is then issued and a phase 2 process is initiated. And in part of the phase 2, the utility takes what it receives throughout the RFP process and brings forward a recommended portfolio. The commission will then issue a final decision on whether or not it's going to approve the portfolio, modify the portfolio, or reject the portfolio that the utilities brought forth. The last thing that I want to touch on, the last area, is I'm going to talk a little bit about I guess we're not technically in the phase 2 process here in Colorado, but we have finished the phase 1 process. And as a kickoff, a kind of precursor to the phase 2 process, there has been a really exciting development, and that is that the Colorado Energy Plan has been brought forward to the Commission. What's exciting about the Colorado Energy Plan is that it is a voluntary proposal from Public Service Company of Colorado, Xcel's subsidiary, to potentially retire 2 coal plants, which is just shy of 700 megawatts of coal here in Colorado. The plan was brought forward to the Commission as part of a 15-party stipulated proposal. And so what's really exciting about the Colorado Energy Plan is that unlike where Carla earlier was talking a little bit about the three-case settlement, here the parties spent months sitting down at the table, talking together, and trying to figure out what a framework might look like for presenting a portfolio to the Commission that would include retiring 2 coal plants and then filling that capacity with new resources. It's a great model of collaboration. There are a couple of things that led up to the Colorado Energy Plan that I briefly want to hit on. First, the governor's executive order on climate change. So getting to where we are today, having the governor's office invested and having the governor's office begin to pave the way. This summer, the governor released an executive order which is setting targets for electric utilities in the state of Colorado to hit 25% carbon reductions off of 2012 levels by 2025 and 35% reduction levels by 2030. Following off on that, there have been a lot of social and kind of community initiatives. Xcel and a handful of other groups have heard loud and clear from their customers and from communities that they want more clean energy and they want more renewable energy. A handful of cities in Colorado have passed either goals or standards seeking to achieve 100% renewable energy by a particular time frame, whether that's 2030 or somewhere in that time frame. And so the Colorado Energy Plan has been a response to community and customer desires. And then finally, stakeholders. ERPs in Colorado, might get somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 interveners, which is a whole lot of folks. And to be able to come together with a proposal that 15 have signed off on is really exciting. In this case, the environmental community, staff, Office of Consumer Counsel, industrial customers, labor, and the environmental community have come together on this. And there are a couple of kind of key points that the Colorado Energy Plan includes. One of which is that for this to be brought forward, it's either going to need to be result in cost savings for customers or be neutral. So customers will not be paying more for a lower carbon future. Number 2, there are target amounts of utility ownership and independent power producer ownership. That was a very important and I'm sure hotly negotiated component of the plan, which was that for Xcel to be willing to bring this forward, they needed to know that they were going to be able to maintain some level, a large level of ownership in the replacement generation. That said, there's certainly going to be plenty of capacity available for independent power producers. And I think I'm running out of time here, so I'm probably going to stop with that and allow us to move on and certainly open questions afterward.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. I think we're probably going to cover some of the stuff. There's going to be more discussion about this, the topics that you brought up. But thank you for the macro and micro view, and I'm hoping we get to talk about the Colorado Energy Plan a little bit more. So, Julie, thank you.
Thanks. First of all, I appreciate being invited to this event, and just want to say that it's so nice to see folks that are old friends and to have the opportunity to meet such a esteemed group of women. It's very impressive what you just described, Caitlin, in terms of putting that energy plan together with a 15 stakeholder group, right? That's a lot of people to negotiate with.
I'm going to interrupt for 1 sec because I just want to add something. So the stipulation was filed, and then the commission allowed additional parties to come in.
The party's even bigger now.
It's very big at this point.
That is a party.
Yeah.
I hope you get a disco ball for that. So I'm going to talk about, you heard, and I thought Erin did a very nice job of talking about why it's tough to be a regulator right now. We do have a couple of regulators that are here, Commissioner Edwards, and I see Commissioner Douglas here. You know, before I do that, I was sitting here listening to Caitlin in particular, and it was cracking me up because I'm sure it feels like ancient history to talk about the 70s. So I was there. So what's funny about that is that during the second oil embargo, I was in middle school, and I had a wonderful science teacher named Mr. Alt. And as a result of living in Northeast Ohio and having acidified lakes and a very precarious nuclear power plant in my backyard, I wanted to understand why we didn't have solar power, which is what my teacher, Mr. Alt, did in the summertime. He put on people's roofs. Why didn't we just use that? No pollution, no nuclear radiation. That sounded like the perfect solution. So I built a solar oven with my friend Joy for Science Club. And we made runny chocolate chip cookies and lukewarm hot dogs. And my anti-nuclear, anti-coal, pro-renewable advocacy core was born. So what's funny is that if you had asked me at that time, would I go to law school? My answer would have been yes. I'm going to go to law school. I'm going to get beyond my runny chocolate chip cookies. I'm going to be a lawyer, and I'm going to change the world. Turned out I didn't go to law school. I went to business school, and I spent the first decade of my life working on PURPA, which was, in fact, the first law in 1978 that opened up the opportunity for competition within generations. In fact, I spent a really substantial and formative part of my life understanding what it takes to offer a power plant to somebody who doesn't want one. So when you're an independent power producer, they would actually like a power plant. They just don't want your power plant because that would be a way for them not to make a return on equity on somebody else's billions of dollars. So it was highly informative. And I spent fortunately, I was just thinking this through as I'm hearing the history of my life coming out of Caitlin's mouth. I spent the last 20 years, I just figured that out like today. 20 years I've been in the renewables community. I've been a renewable advocate within the business community, and I've run teams of policy folks that span the globe. So I understand what it takes to make a market turn, and it's remarkable, and I'm going to show you how much the market has turned and why that makes life so difficult for regulators. I will make one point, and it just, again, sitting here listening made me think about it. I'll talk with Alice about this afterwards. One of the roles that I've played since I've been in Colorado about 3 years is I've been the executive in residence for the Global Energy Management Program, which is kind of a specialty master's program at the University of Colorado Denver's Business School. It is a wonderful program. In fact, I'll speak at the graduation of their 16th cohort in January. And it occurs to me that there's a real opportunity for the folks in this room to be better engaged. And the reason I bring this up is it's not just tough to be a regulator these days, it's tough to be an oil company. Really, it is tough to be an oil company. And I can tell you that because they call me up and ask me to do work for them as a consultant. And they are struggling with how to take an entire corporate structure which is laden with essentially the equivalent of an oil tanker in terms of agility and flexibility, and turn into a company that can actually deal with the pace of change, just like the regulatory community is. So I appreciate the fact that we're at a point where not just the regulators, but the energy companies themselves are having to deal with change in a way that is extraordinary. And just this morning, while I was sitting in the audience, I got a note from one of the GEM students asking me for advice because he works in the Bakersfield oil fields. He's just had policy change come down on his company, and he'd like to get in the renewables sector. So the world really is shifting, and the question is why. I'm going to spend a little time talking about that on a macro basis. First of all, how many of you have seen this chart before? Okay. I'll spend just a minute talking about it. This is an incredibly helpful chart, I think. It shows the new electric power capacity additions annually by type in the United States all the way back to 1930, goes through 2016. The themes that you'll take away from it are that we built a whole heck of a lot of power plants between 1960 and about 1990, and then there was a little bit of a lull as a result of what Caitlin was talking about, what was happening in the power regulatory community in the 90s, thinking about competition. But one of the things that you will also take away is the different colors. We built almost, a majority to a, plurality of coal plants between about 1960 and 1990, supplemented by natural gas, which interestingly went away in the 80s. And that was a function of the oil embargoes, and basically we were precluded from building natural gas power plants in the 80s. I can tell you that because we went to the Florida PSC and tried to tell them that we didn't want to build a coal plant as an independent power producers. We wanted to build a gas plant. We had a really good reason for that. We were precluded from doing so because it was not the avoided unit, and it was like literally illegal to build a gas plant at the time, which is hilarious given what happened after the energy crisis in California in the 2000s. Look at the size of those annual capacity additions. Holy guacamole, over 50 gigs in an individual year in about 2004. And that was higher than any previous year. 30 gigs-ish was the highest previously in the mid-70s. There are trends in the way that things work. They are somewhat regulatory in nature because rules make a market in the power industry, but that's not all. There's also technology changes coming. And what you saw happen in the 2000s was changes in gas turbines. Changes in gas turbines changed the way that we built new capacity. The green is wind. That's a function of both regulatory and technology. And solar, just in the 2012 through 2016 period, has come on in a big way. What I want to focus on is gas fell to second place behind wind and solar in 2015. That was the year of the turn. So let's take a look at 2016 for a minute. Just looking at renewables, in 2016 on the right-hand side, you'll see that wind and solar combined, both distributed and utility scale, 70% of new capacity additions. Okay, that happened back in, I think it was about 2007 or 8 in Europe. So we've had 10 years where renewables dominate in Europe, 10 years. We've had 2 years in the United States, but we're now in inevitability land. That will be the future. That's incredibly important to understand because it makes regulators' jobs different and it makes energy companies' jobs different. Why is that? And I have tremendous conviction on this point. Why is that inevitability going to continue? And the answer is because solar specifically and lithium-ion batteries are mass production equipment. You do not build them one at a time like a gas turbine. That is a fundamental shift to the power sector that it has never seen before. But that inevitability makes it just like chips, just like everything else in the IT sector that's made out of silicon. We will see lower prices with higher volumes. The data is indisputable. We have 10 years of solar data, and the answer is costs go down. Prices do not always go down. There are supply and demand dynamics. There's bobbles, but the trend, give me a 6-month to 12-month trend, the answer is down and to the right. These are actual PPA prices and real data. Where's that going to go? Let me just pick out a couple of years here. We hit under $2 in 2012. This is $2 per watt for a utility scale solar plant. In 2017, it's going to be under $1 a watt. This is Bloomberg's forecast. They say under 75 cents a watt before 2025. The important point is that number, even with a trade tariff, will still trend down and to the right despite artificial tariff dynamics. I'll put aside the tariffs and we'll talk about there during Q&A. The overarching message is the costs go down, and this doesn't happen in any predictable way in prior versions of the power sector that I showed you in the first slide. Where did this come from? Interestingly enough, solar in the United States was driven by distributed through California's solar initiative. This is California data, you can get it off the website. The most interesting point here is, if you look at the entire California Solar Initiative, the program, the $3 billion program that supported solar on a distributed basis in the state through rebates, in 2015 and 2016, the amount of incremental additions well beyond the end of the program was higher than the entire 10-year program was supposed to be. So that is market transformation. We're there. It's over. 2015 was the year where it was definitive. What's interesting is when you think about market transformation, what a regulator thinks about market transformation, they usually have a fairly narrow view in one segment. Here's what happened in California. Not only did we transform the distributed market, we transformed the utility scale market. This is one of my favorite stories. So in August of 2008, the company I was with at the time, SunPower, and another solar company announced with Pacific Gas and Electric 500 megawatts of utility scale solar. It was the first utility scale solar in the world. The largest solar plants that had been built previously were about 20 megawatts in Spain. It was an absolutely tectonic announcement, tectonic. It had massive implications. It drove China to do what it's done. Did anybody remember how many total gigawatts of electric generation capacity I showed on the first chart in 2016 that were added in the United States? Anybody? It was a little under 30 gigs. China last year, solar alone, how many gigawatts installed? Anybody know? 35. 35 gigs solar alone. More solar installed in China last year than the entire United States generation capacity addition. Okay? How many gigawatts of solar year to date through Q3 in China this year? Anybody know? Oh, come on, you gotta read the stuff I read. 42 gigs. They're gonna hit 50 gigs of solar installed this year. I can't emphasize enough what California did globally. The global implications of what California did were absolutely startling. There's very few examples on Earth of the implication of that announcement in 2008. But 1 month later in 2008, I had to intervene in a California Energy Commission proceeding because Commissioner Douglas was not there yet. The list of resources in their IEPR that year for all the RPS resources ignored and excluded, it wasn't on the list, solar photovoltaic. Not on the list. We had just announced 500 megawatts of contracts with the utility. It wasn't on the list. I got it on the list. But the implications were magnificent. Nobody thought it was possible to make PV at a utility scale level. As many of you know, you have a beautiful PV power plant, which I had a little touch of a hand in down at Comanche in southern Colorado. That's the largest now east of the Rockies. That's the inevitability. That's coming. There's another implication. Once you get very high penetration of renewable and particularly solar, and we're seeing this in California, this is real data available every day on the California Independent System Operators website. You too can look at what I do. What we are seeing is curtailed gigawatt hours. And the reason, there's lots of good reasons for that. I could talk for an hour on it. But the important data around it is it's changing system operations. This is not saying it's endangering system operations. It's changing it. It changes the economics and system operations. What the top chart shows is curtailed gigawatt hours year to date, it's in megawatt hours, by hour of the day. So that's summing it up through, I think it was Tuesday of this week when I pulled the data. And what you see is we're consistently curtailing, particularly in the first 6 months of this year, over 300 gigawatt hours were curtailed through June, 345 through earlier this week. So overwhelmingly it was the first half of this year because of the dynamics of demand versus supply of solar. And what you see is we're consistently curtailing between 9 and 5. That's critical data. We are not consistently curtailing between noon and 1.
Why is that critical data? Because if you're a resource planner or a commissioner, what it just told you is you don't have to only charge your electric vehicle overnight with wind, and you don't only have to charge it at the very peak. You can show up at your law school at 9, unplug at 5, and you are helping the system during the entire period, charging your electric vehicle all day long. That matters because whether you're using a level 1 or level 2 charger, it's a lot less expensive if you don't have to install level 2 chargers. So on the bottom chart, let me just point out, it shows by month our curtailed megawatt hours, overwhelmingly solar here. And what's interesting here is April and March were the really big curtailment months. We had a great hydro year in California. But take a look at June. June looks a lot less, right? But here's the thing, it's a good solar month. On a Sunday in June, we started curtailing solar in California at 7 a.m. Think about that. The sun comes up over the horizon, we start curtailing. Okay, what that says is if you're a regulator, a utility, an independent power producer, a solar developer, a battery developer, you just had a market change that you need to respond to. So how is that happening? The markets are dictating that the signal is being sent loud and clear. 2012 is the top, 2017 is the bottom. Prices, look at the black line. Interestingly, if you take a look on the right-hand axis and the black line, you'll see that in 2012, prices move around all the time. But look at what happened in 2017. This is April. You see negative prices on the 16th, and you see prices that spike during the end of the ramp period as the sun goes down, go up above $70. Not for a long time. It doesn't plateau at $70, but you have a spike up to $70. The market just said, fix it. It said developers show up and fix it. It also said to regulators and the California Independent System Operator, think about your market rules, because your market rules can actually inhibit or help draw responses into the market. Responses are going to be energy storage. Here's the actual data on a log-log graph of the learning curve for solar in green and for lithium-ion batteries in blue. In both cases, we're talking about mass production technologies. Costs go down with volumes, consistent across all kinds of technology. My confidence that solar and storage as a combination are going to provide essentially any shape power you want. You want 6 by 16, you got it. You don't, you want a shaped product, you can get it. It's just a question of how much solar, how much storage, and where do you put it in your system? What's my confidence that we're going to have as much storage as we want for the grid? The answer is very high, because I just spent the last year working on electric vehicles, and electric vehicles will drive and have already driven billions of dollars of capacity additions for new manufacturing facilities. The scale of what we need in energy storage is a pittance compared to the scale of electricity storage required for electric vehicles. What that means is vehicles will drive the capacity additions, will drive the cost reductions, ensuring that you can have basically as many batteries as you want for the grid. GM agrees, by the way. Even GM and Ford are finally capitulating that the future is electric and say things like this in investor conferences. Both in May and June of this year, GM made very clear statements just after Ford ousted their CEO because he wasn't thoughtful enough about electric vehicles coming. Utilities like renewable energy and energy storage, it's nirvana, actually. They may have obstacles to fully embracing what is actually nirvana for them, but fundamentally it is nirvana because it's rapid to market. You don't have to carry construction work in progress like you would with a nuclear plant for 10 to 12 years. It's large. The volumes we're talking about are tens of gigawatts, as you saw in the first graph, by 2025. It's dispersed. We have the ability to put it anywhere you want. You have problems in your grid, you put it where you need it. What will be true is that we're going to see the kind of domination we've seen in grid scale versus distributed solar. That will be actually more true in storage. I'm not saying that there won't be lots of distributed solar. What I'm saying is that the utility scale solar drives volume, which drives price. Let me just make a few comments quickly about why what I'm saying is actually already widely discussed with the investor community and the IOU community. The largest global renewable energy asset owner is planning to put $500 million into energy storage by 2020, and they've admitted that that's a very small amount of money relative to what they'll do after 2020. That is NextEra. They operate Florida Power and Light in Florida, but they also own the largest amount of renewable generation. We'll check what happens with Brookfield. They just closed Terraform yesterday. They're doing global shortly. They may eclipse NextEra shortly, but for now, let's just look at NextEra. This is their investor deck to their analyst day, a multi-hour presentation to their investors in June of this year. And what they said was, expect the 70% decline they've already seen from 2010 to 2016 from wind to continue. Expect the 70% decline they've seen in solar. I could dispute the numbers a little bit. It's a little bigger, but okay, let's take 70. 70% decline from 2010 to 2016 in solar to continue. And, oh, by the way, in storage, same story. 70% decline, and they expect that to continue. So what they've done is converted that to what the adder is to add battery storage to wind or solar, and they come up with, call it 10 to 20 bucks a megawatt hour, a cent or two a kilowatt hour, by 2020. That's why it's an inflection point for them in their investor decks, because 2020 is when they get to that number, at which they will probably admit off stage is going to be closer to the low end. If you can only add a cent a kilowatt hour to wind or solar, to add storage, to shape it any way you want, that is the holy grail, which is what Jim Robo, their CEO, has heard to be said. Here's what they're showing you. 2020 wind and solar. Wind with the adder, 3 to 4 cents. Solar with the adder, 4 to 5 cents. Completely shaped. That beats existing coal and existing nuclear. Not new, existing. New wind and solar plus storage beating existing coal and nuclear. That's why it doesn't matter what happens trying to bring back coal plants. Not going to happen. The question is what happens relative to new combined cycle. Well, if you're NextEra, that is a tricky question to answer because NextEra owns FPL, an electric utility which has miraculously managed to get their Public Service Commission to approve electric utility ownership, not gas utility, electric utility ownership of gas pipelines for all of their new gas plants in Florida. It would be a bad idea to tell the regulators through their investor presentations that their wind and solar plus storage is going to beat all those gas plants they just got built. So they don't do that. However, I will. So it turns out commodity cycles go up and down, which means that 3 to 4 cents ain't always going to be 3 to 4 cents.
Julie, can I ask how much longer are you going to go?
That's my last slide.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you.
What I'd just like to point out is that the change that is not just forecast, but now effectively embedded in our markets is putting pressure for the kinds of conversations I heard this morning to really be brought to light. You can't do what we've done in the past. We can't take 5 years to figure out what we're going to do when technology is changing in a matter of months.
Thank you for those fascinating slides, Julie. So next, Virginia, thank you so much. And I think Virginia's going to focus on
one
modeling
piece
and
of that market
ERPs
transformation.
and distribution.
But I'm going to try and go pretty quickly so we can catch up a little bit.
It's okay. You should take the time that you were given. Thank you.
No, that's okay. All right. So thank you all for having me. I am Virginia Lacey. I'm a principal with the electricity program at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I have the great pleasure of being here, living just down the road and working just down the road. So it's a treat to be able to be here. And my own technology, let's see, is this sweet? So for those of you that may not be familiar with Rocky Mountain Institute, we're an organization that was founded here in Colorado by Ann Levins about 35 years ago. We have 2 offices still here in Colorado, one in the Roaring Fork Valley in Basalt and one here in Boulder. We also have now offices on the East Coast and in China, and we're growing fairly rapidly. Our mission is to drive the transformation of the U.S. and a global energy system to a clean, prosperous, and secure future, so no small task.
And we are a think and do tank, so that we both do research and analysis as well as collaborating with a variety of partners in various industries. This is just a quick profile of some of the work that we do in the electricity program and some of the work that I've led, research and analysis, and specifically utility partnerships and engagements directly, working with them to help embrace this future that we've just heard Julie articulate. And then I have most directly been involved with utility commissions in the last several years, working in the New York environment with Reforming Energy Vision, and now working with the commission in Hawaii on some of the same challenges that they're facing with these trends. So the panel, of course, is about electricity and resource planning. So I just thought spending a second to talk about, sort of at a high level, what some of the tensions are right now, and we've heard a lot of those. So I'm just going to quickly state environmental and energy policies. The federal piece is a lot about actually the uncertainty that's happening right now in the environment, but we still have quite a lot of activity and commitments on the state and local level. There's been a fuel shift over the last decade, which Julie already articulated, so I won't go into that. But I think the biggest one, as you all have heard about, is coal and the rapid decline from coal from its position at 50% to now 30%, which is a pretty significant shift, and natural gas taking a pretty significant role in that, but so is the increase in renewables. We've also had the declining clean energy costs, so we already heard about that. The thing too, though, I think to stress, which may be a little bit different than what we've also already talked about, is flat or declining load growth. That is really creating very significant change for when we're thinking about how utilities make money right now. And we've seen actually flat or declining load growth declining actually in the United States since 2010. Which is a remarkable change. I'm going to be chatting about why some of that has come to pass, which is the development of distributed energy resources in large measure and energy efficiency. We also have seen a lot of changing consumer preferences. That's what's actually helping to drive that shift. And then the ability, the information communication and technology deployment, which is actually going to allow for the optimization of all of that fun stuff that's coming on the system. So because of all of that, I have to quote Yogi Berra. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. What I'm providing right now is 12 different power plans that have come out over the last several years from a variety of utilities across the West. And what you're seeing there on the red is the base forecast from what they projected they were going to see in terms of load or demand in their region. What you're seeing there in terms of blue is actually what resulted. The gray is depending on how they actually created their forecasts, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But what this is just showing is there are some changing winds that are happening right now, and the planning that we have in place is starting to only catch up. And one of the most significant paradigm shifts, in addition to all of the things that we've been hearing about throughout, is about this role of customers and the distribution system. So the historical focus has been a lot on upscale, big generation, big transmission down to the distribution system. We plug in, we take that power. Now, actually, what we're starting to see is a lot of investment on the distribution side, everything from the substation down, and that customers are actually starting to become more active prosumers. I hate to use that term, but I can't come up with anything better. So if anybody has an idea, let me know. But that is where innovation is happening rapidly today. So Julie was also talking about the proliferation of solar and the big utility scale that has gone in. I also just wanted to add that 1/3 of today's solar PV is actually on the customer side of the meter, which is, that is a significantly profound change from the top-down approach that we have had over the last 100 or so years in the utility sector. We now have actively engaged customers who are becoming generators, who are also reducing the amount of power that they're taking from the utility and actually exporting it to the utility, which is an entirely different paradigm shift. But also, solar has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of the attention of utilities in particular. But distributed energy resources are more broad than just solar and distributed PV. And I think it's really important that we think about that. And it's also in addition to storage. It is the electric vehicles, which is a component of the storage. It is the technology and enabling technology that will allow us to be able to optimize. It's your Nest thermostat, adaptive thermostats. It's all the things that enables us actually to see this paradigm shift from supply being managed to meet demand, to now that we can actually see demand as the opportunity to potentially also help balance the system. So we've seen some of the trends. I'm just highlighting right now a couple of the distributed energy resource pieces. So this is both what has happened in the last few years in terms of electric vehicles, but then also behind the meter storage. The important thing is actually what Julie was getting at, which is this is a very different type of market transformation when you've now entered into the consumer market. You're now talking about very different dynamics than what we've seen in the past, because we go out and purchase widgets and iPhones, and this very different market trends than what we've seen in the past. So as a result of that, what we're starting to see is some of the same forecasts that we've seen in terms of PV and the adoption of PV, and that is actually changing the system fundamentally. And the reality is that consumer-driven change can happen very quickly. This is an example of that from Easter parades in New York City in 1900. I don't know if I have a laser pointer, so I can't maybe I do. Oh, I do. So this is the first car, actually, in this picture. On the other side, there's the horse is actually back over here. And all I'm trying to point out here is in 13 years, we saw some very significant changes because of consumer-driven decisions. Hawaii provides one example of this, and there are some interesting dynamics in Hawaii because of the power prices there. When you're competing with 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which is easily 4 and 5 times, in some cases above what we've seen on the mainland, solar can pencil out pretty quickly in terms of the economics. What you're looking at here are, this is the latest that I had available, which is just from July of 2015. These are actually the circuits in this area on Oahu. So this is, for those of you all that have been there, this is the North Shore, this is Honolulu. You're seeing the penetration of solar on the circuits in those environments, in those neighborhoods, which is very, very, very significant, to the point now where in Hawaii, 16% or 1 out of 6 customers in Hawaii, residential customers, has solar on their roof. And 1 out of 20 in the commercial side has solar. So that is fundamentally unique on multiple levels, both from a physical perspective in terms of how we've designed the system, and secondarily in terms of actually how we're paying for that system. So this has created a lot of ire for utilities that have been selling electricity through volumetric rates or per kilowatt hour. And so what we're going to start to see over the next few years is a shift to thinking more about the services that are being delivered as opposed to the kilowatt hour sales. Just a couple more to highlight. The other thing I think just to be super clear about in terms of the implications on planning is the distinction here when we're talking about some of these new technologies coming on the distribution system. The benefits and costs are very temporally or locationally different. The further that you go down into the system and the more that you see, and this is actually something too that Julie was highlighting about the ability to support the grid in different ways, you have a much more diverse system as you go further down, dispersed. And so in terms of how that particular either distributed generation resource or the storage that you're seeing in terms of electric vehicles, how that is actually working with the grid is different depending on the time of day and the location in which you are connected. And that is incredibly important to think about when we think about the signals that we need for customers to both benefit themselves in terms of taking that energy when they want it, but also when the system actually needs it. So the way that we have been at RMI thinking a lot about that is on prices. Price signals are ways in which that you can very rapidly enable, once we have the metering infrastructure to do that, we do here in Boulder with our smart grid city, to send a price signal to a customer that power is actually very expensive at that time, and actually you have a really valuable resource that we would love to have more of. So that's one of the reasons why the planning and thinking about that is so important. And it's why California is now actually thinking more and more about integrated distribution planning, thinking about ways that you can look at distinct areas, perform analysis on that locational side, and looking at distributed generation forecasts, which is a very different thing than what we've seen in previous and conventional planning. And then also being able to make use of triggers and signposts to revisit plans of adoption is significantly different than anticipated. This has profound consequences in terms of whether or not we're going to need certain transmission lines, if we need certain other centralized power plants. This is ultimately, if you think about both this and the adoption of efficiency, your LED bulbs that we now have rapidly proliferating, these long lead time investments that we need to make, we need to start being smarter about them because this is becoming more uncertain in terms of what that demand will look like. So this is to wrap up some of the perspectives that those drivers, I think, are having in terms of resource planning best practices. I think what we're going to start to see is more integration and coordination across multiple different dimensions of the electricity system. When we think about planning from the regulatory perspective and with IOUs or any of the other utilities, and that is one, having clear understanding of system operations and system planning working together. There's some profound consequences along those lines. Transmission and distribution, for a long time, they've been pretty separate and treated separately, and we're now going to have to think about ways in which they can be coordinated. Demand and supply options, really thinking that demand is actually a real resource and not just playing lip service to that because it's real. And the fact that other utilities and planning regions are going to also have to be thoughtful about how they integrate more of these resources. Explicit inclusion of more comprehensive evaluation criteria and investment selection. And so this is actually, in fact, Erin mentioned this earlier in her remarks about the need for thinking beyond just least cost. Because the ultimate thing that we have to be concerned about here is changing realities. It's about risk mitigation and adaptability, and we also have significant environmental considerations that are growing and are being wrapped into these considerations. The third point is about continued improvements in representing variable renewables and demand-side investments, which I've sort of already articulated to some extent here. There's going to be a lot more modeling that is going to be necessary and thinking about how we predict the uptake of certain widgets and thinking about where that uptake and why. It's a lot of the market considerations we have when we think about expanding markets for consumer goods. Finally, developing and adopting improved approaches for risk management. This is my one little beyond nerd that I'll go for a second, which is using probabilistic stochastic modeling, and all that's a fancy way of saying that you need to think about randomness in your planning. And so there are quantitative ways and approaches that we do this all the time with stocks. We do this all the time when we're thinking about things that are not, there are elements of that are not easily predicted. We need to start to enable that, include that in our planning processes, and then to make use of triggers and signposts. I think it was Erin who was also saying about every 2 years here in Colorado, kind of coming back to the plan and making sure, are we on the right trajectory? And what sort of shifts do we need to happen? Because if you if you're in the state of South Carolina, for example, which is where I happen to be from, you may know that a few months ago there was a really bad bet because a lot of this was not taken into consideration. And so a nuclear plant was being built, has now been put on hold. It's now it's an $8 billion giant skate park in the middle of northern in the northern part of South Carolina. And so $8 billion that ratepayers are actually paying for right now, 20% of their rates are going for a non-functioning, non-operating plant, we don't want to make those mistakes, and we have tools to ensure that we are taking that into consideration. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Virginia. That was just a fascinating, relevant presentation. Thank you so much. And I have to mention I'm from South Carolina also. We should chat about that.
Gosh, I didn't know that.
So this panel, we were supposed to leave room for questions, but we have this extremely passionate, informed group of panelists that have tremendous expertise, and I think they add a lot of value, even though we didn't get to a lot of questions. But so let's start with a student question. I actually have a bunch of questions too, but I'm sure the audience does as well. So maybe we could go a little bit over time. Yeah. So Gabi, we're definitely going to get to you, but I think we're going to do a student first. I don't know what that sound is.
It's the who's it's going up.
Okay.
Hi, so my name is Stephanie. Thank you all for being here today. This has been a really interesting conversation. So I have a question about, I guess, IRPs and how they actually function on the ground, because I think it's, a great academic exercise to talk about what's in the regulatory text or the law, but how are PUCs implementing these plans, and how are utilities and IOUs actually following through? And are there any, regulatory tools or sticks at the PUC's disposal to, force implementation?
That is a great question, and I think we'll start with Erin, because she is absolutely has been very involved in the current ERPs and in Colorado and across the West, and can probably address that very well. And then Virginia, if you would like to talk to that one as well, and also anybody else that wants to talk about it. I also think that one of the things we need to talk about is how on the ground, the structures that we have in place, how they need to sort of change to address the themes that we've talked about here. So if I can throw that into the question as well, if you can remember all of that, that would be great.
So I guess what I would say is that I think when we talk about not a lot of this gets translated into the actual IRP process, if I'm going to be totally frank. I will say that as if I waltz in as a highfalutin conservation organization and I'm like, are you taking into account randomness in your models? Nobody, most of the people that are kind of the other stakeholders that are involved in IRP processes are like, yes, I want to talk about what that means and how we would do that here. It's more about, like I said, oh God, I've got 1,000 pages and we've got to figure out what's going on and we've got to get this all done in 280 days. And we don't have time to talk about how we could be improving this process. We've got to just get through what's in front of us today. So I think there's at least from my perspective as somebody who works mostly in Colorado, there's not a forum really for stakeholders to engage with the commission. And I think with the commission is a really important part of that about how could this process be improved and what are things we've learned and how can we kind of engage and bring this up to speed and have it reflect more the reality of our day-to-day lived experience. In terms of the carrots and the sticks and about utilities kind of following through, one thing that I would just say is that in Colorado, like I said, we've got a longer ERP process than most states. We do them every 4 years. And what's happened is that historically, over the last 8 years or so, the utility will go through an ERP, and then they'll come back 6 months later and be like, holy moly, you guys, there's this really cheap wind. I know we just did an ERP, but we really need to get this wind. That's happened like 3 or 4 times. So you've got this whole beautiful process where you're going out and doing all source solicitations and engaging the market and finding the best resources. But then because there's so much time between ERPs, the utility is coming back and getting other bites at the apple to get resources outside of that process. That's something that the commission has expressed really clearly that they don't like. And I think the commission has also identified some other things about its resource planning rules that it wants to reevaluate, and we expect there to be a big, giant monster rulemaking governing both the resource planning process and the renewable energy procurement process happening in the next 6 months, and this could all be different a year from now. So there is going to finally be an opportunity to talk about, is this really the best way to be doing resource planning, and how can we improve it?
And I'll just comment that I completely agree with Erin that I don't think that stakeholders, while they've got the 45 days to respond to the 1,000 pages, is a productive use of time to argue for the models. It's why the regulators need to be, I guess, engaged ahead of that. In addition, I mean, it's similar to some of the process changes that happened in Colorado's ERP process in the last several years, where there was actual legislation that was passed and certain rules that were made. That's the time when that needs to happen. And I think it's the engagement proactively as opposed to in that reactive position where it's really critical. But just to make sure and disseminate that these are the best practices that are going on right now. And here's why you actually really need to care about that, because it makes difference of, to people's, to customers' bills, ultimately, like in the example I've just talked about in South Carolina.
And just one thing, I'd love to give a shout out to Commissioner Edwards, and two things about Illinois that in some ways are models to look at. In number one, Illinois, particular Commissioner Edwards and her team have done a really amazing job putting on a series of policy sessions, and they happen very regularly. And it'll be a multi-hour event. It's public. It's transcribed, where a commissioner will take a pet issue, put panelists on. It is a non-docketed part outside of a docketed proceeding where stakeholders can come together and talk about issues with all of the commissioners in a room. So that's one great thing they do. Another odd thing, I don't know whether it's the model that other states should follow, but Illinois has a very unique process for procurement, and that is that there is actually a separate state agency, the Illinois Power Authority, or the Illinois Power Agency, that handles and oversees the power procurement process for utilities in the state. And so whether that's the way or not, if anything, it means that the state has put resources to having folks who specifically look at the resource planning process. It happens very differently in Illinois than in vertically integrated states, but that's just something that I'd like to draw some attention to, that happens differently there than I've seen in a lot of other states.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I think Gabriella had a question.
Thank you all very much. My name is Gabriella Stockmeyer. I practice with some of these lovely ladies, and I thought your presentations were great. So today, the Public Utilities Commission is meeting to talk about next steps for the Mountain West Transmission Group. And you guys touched on some really interesting movements in the world of utilities. And so I wondered if you just had any comments on why utilities are eager to move forward to join the SPP, what's in it for them, and then how that affects electric resource planning going forward.
You want to go first? Well, I guess I would say that I think that utilities are really seeing this opportunity now in markets, and there have been a lot of kind of attempts to make it happen, looking west, looking east, and we haven't quite figured out where the right fit is going to be for Colorado utilities that have come together in this Mountain West Transmission Group. The current proposal on the table is to join the Southwest Power Pool, and I think my understanding about what's kind of spurring that, why SPP is interested in looking west, why the Mountain West Transmission Group is looking at linking up with somebody else, is because they see the constraints of having a small footprint, and they see the opportunities that are available when there's a wider footprint that you can trade power across. And from WRA's perspective, expanding that geographic diversity is one of the key things that we can do in order to increase our deployment of intermittent renewables, because it allows you to use geographic diversity essentially as a balancing doohickey. Super lawyer word. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, but I think how it impacts resource planning, and more importantly, how it impacts the way the system is actually being deployed, whether you actually are utilizing more renewable resources, you're actually using more wind, or whether you're just ramping up coal and sending it on to your neighbor. I think that really depends on the individual structure, and this is just super detailed kind of governance decisions that are made by those bodies. And so the applications that we expect to see from the Mountain West Transmission Group about whether the commission should kind of authorize them to join the SPP, I think that's going to be a huge issue, because the benefits you see from markets depend on doing it right. it's really critical how you actually pull that thing off if you're able to see the benefits that we think are possible. And so those are going to be really important proceedings.
And if I could ask, Virginia, I know you're about to go, and I appreciate it. I think the issue of participation is also crucial with this decision of whether or not to transfer into the SVP power pool. So thank you. Go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, actually, just in the interest of time, I mean, Erin, I think, articulated it well in terms of both the integration of variable renewables, but then also, I mean, there are any time where you are making market changes in that way, there are winners and losers, and some of the utilities see some winning opportunity for using some of those assets more than would be in the current environment. And that's actually, I think that's actually beneficial generally, because what we are talking about is better asset utilization across the patch. So that would be kind of my short answer, I guess.
Yeah, I think some of the issues that are going to be coming up are also a lot of the discussion today so far with both panels has been stakeholder participation, and I think that's one of the issues that our commission should be looking at with this issue.
Exit fees. I just learned about that the other day. $770,000 to exit once you're in, even if you're like an NGO.
So SVP has
That's bananas.
essentially sort of structural barriers to stakeholder participation that I think hopefully will be addressed if that move is made here in Colorado. But thank you for the question. I think we're out of time. I'm getting indication, and I know there are so many people that have other questions. I had about 10 questions. 2 of them I really wanted to get to, but I think we're going to stop, and hopefully discussion will continue over lunch. Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you. Please join me.
Rating as well, thank you. So we're moving upstairs. We have a really special presentation and keynote by Commissioner Edwards. Basically, we're going right up here. So you walk up the stairs and do a U-turn back to the cafeteria. There's lunch up there. And we'll have a break right after that, so hopefully you can forego checking emails and all that stuff, and we can get right upstairs. And we'll also have time for more conversation too, so you'll be able to ask questions of the panelists. Thanks again.